Depending on when you view this presentation, I would like to wish you a good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. Today we will begin our discussion on the chapter dedicated to decision making, which I believe is a good complement to the chapter on problem solving we just finished, because problem solving oftentimes entails making decisions. As par for the course, I oftentimes like to utilize quotes to introduce new topics. And today's quotes are brought to you by Mr. William James and the classic rock band known as Rush. What these quotes emphasize is the fact that when we are forced to make a decision, even if we choose not to make a decision, we are still making a choice. Now, whether we choose not to make a decision because we're not willing to or are unable to, that is a topic of discussion that we will discuss a little bit more in depth going forward. To begin with, what is a decision? A decision is a choice among possibilities. Oftentimes, decisions vary in difficulty. Choosing what to eat tonight for dinner is an easier decision than trying to decide what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And what all decisions share, regardless of the difficulty or the possibilities, are the values we impose on each option and the likelihood that the choice we make will lead to some favorable outcome. Historically, we have tried to utilize theories to help explain how people make decisions. Because even when the decisions we have to make are easier decisions, it can still be a very complex process. Two theories that have been proposed to help explain how people make decisions are normative theories and descriptive theories. Normative theories tell us how we should decide, what is the best choice among different alternatives. Descriptive theories tell us how we actually decide. These theories tend to focus more on how we as people sometimes behave irrationally. For example, a normative theory would tell us that in the Monty Hall problem, we should switch because statistically we have greater chance of picking the car. However, descriptive theories say, well, people don't always behave rationally. Somebody may think that I'm lucky, I was born lucky, so if I pick the right door to begin with, why would I switch? Because I've already picked the car. Ultimately, the goal of these theories is to really account for and predict patterns that occur in people's daily decision making processes. Before we get ahead of ourselves, it's very important that we start to think about decisions in terms of the ABCs. All decisions have alternatives. Even when you're faced with a choice, You can always choose not to decide. Should you stay? Should you switch Monty Hall? Should you go to grad school? Should you go get a job? If you go get a job, which job? This job? That job? Now, because there are always alternatives, we may have inherent beliefs about how likely these alternatives will manifest themselves given the choices we make. If we choose to go to grad school, what's our probability of getting in? Well, I believe I'm going to get in because I'm a great student. And of course, whenever we make a choice, all choices have consequences. There are benefits to be gained and losses that can be accrued. Even when you make a choice, when you choose one option over another, you may miss out on something. However, you may also gain something else in lieu of what you missed out on. Each alternative, then, has its own unique consequences, both benefits and losses that could occur. Ultimately, the ABCs are always present because when we make decisions in the real world, they often occur when there's more uncertainty than certainty. Meaning that even as we evaluate each possible choice and we try to determine which one's going to produce the best opportunity for us to achieve our goals, there are things that can exist that we cannot account for in advance that could prevent us from achieving our goals or being as happy as we could possibly be with the choice we make. For example, maybe after graduation, you have to make a choice. Go to grad school. Do you get a job? You might be unsure of what you're going to do at this point. That's okay. Because even if you choose to go to grad school or you plan on getting a job, there are a million questions that you may need to consider before you make this choice. Hopefully, not a million, but there are quite a few things that are important to consider because they can impact whether or not you're making the best choice for yourself. You choose to go to grad school. What school? What program? How long? Where is it? You choose to get a job. What job? How many positions are available? How many applications have been received? Are you qualified? Are you going to make enough money? So on and so forth. The following diagram is what we call a decision tree, which is a visual representation of different pathways or branches we could pursue depending on the choices we make. In this example, the question is, what do you do if you drop food on the floor? Do you eat it or not? The first point they have up here is, did anyone see you? Well, I personally believe maybe like some of you, it's 5 second rule. Was the food on the floor for 5 seconds or more? Yes, well, that's a no-go. If it's under 5 seconds, well, now we got to consider. Was it sticky? And so on and so forth. Now we can use decision trees to help us answer and assess our ABCs for common decisions. So we can make one. A decision tree, for example, with two choices where the point is what to do after graduation. Do we go to grad school? Do we get a job? Here we're just trying to show different pathways we could pursue. Now this diagram is just further expanding upon that first branch of our decision-making tree regarding what to do after graduation. And you'll notice that even if we choose to go to grad school or we try to get a job, there's a key word here: uncertainty. Even if we choose to go to grad school, there's no guarantee we'll get in. Even if we choose to go get a job, there's no guarantee that we are going to get that job. So uncertainty, definitely present. Now, despite this uncertainty, we might say, you know what? I really want to go to grad school. And we apply. Maybe we get accepted. Maybe we get rejected. On the other hand, you say, you know what? I don't want to go to grad school. I'd rather just get a job. Maybe we get paid. Maybe we have to live at home with our parents for the rest of our lives. Uncertainty. Now, building upon the normative theories and the descriptive theories that we talked about previously, there are different models that researchers have proposed to account for how people assess the ABCs with respect to decisions. There are compensatory models. Two examples will be the additive model and the additive difference model. And then there are non-compensatory models. Examples we'll discuss are elimination by aspects, conjunctive model, and satisficing search. Compensatory models are strategies that allow the positive attributes associated with a choice to compensate for the negative attributes. So the good makes up for the bad. So for example, down below we have the choice between buying a truck and a car, both with poor gas mileage. I believe most of us would say poor gas mileage is a negative attribute, because that means we're going to spend more money to drive that particular vehicle. However, some of us may prefer the truck because it's a little bit more spacious, has a smooth ride, or looks good. Those would be positive attributes. Others would say, I prefer the Lambo over here because even though it's not spacious, it looks good. And that could be a really big positive attribute as you're cruising downtown. Additive models propose that when we have to make a choice between two alternatives, we will look at each alternative independently. Within each alternative, we will look at specific attributes, and for each attribute, we will assign some subjective score to that attribute, arguably based on how useful that attribute is to us. Once we have assigned these values to all attributes for each alternative, we will add them up and then compare the total for each alternative to each other. So that if one alternative has a higher total score, that suggests that is the better choice for us to make. Additive difference does a similar process, except that rather than calculating a total score for each alternative, we actually begin by subtracting the difference in each attribute values across different alternatives. We do that for all attributes we're looking at, and then we add up the differences. And if the remaining difference is a positive value, that indicates that alternative A had more utility to us than alternative B. If the remaining difference is negative, we should then go with the second option, alternative B, because its positives were larger than alternative A. So it's the same kind of process where the positives are being utilized to compensate for negatives associated with specific alternatives. To illustrate the additive and additive difference models, let's pretend like you have to pick a new apartment and you're rating different apartments from a negative to positive scale for these four criteria or attributes. This is not an exhaustive list of all the attributes you may consider when making this choice, but I've tried to pick four that I think would be something college students would want to consider. So for each alternative, apartment A, apartment B, they're assigned a score for each attribute. So if we notice, for example, apartment B has a higher score for rent compared to apartment A. It also has a higher score for noise level. However, apartment A is apparently closer to campus, and they're both about equally clean. Now, if we were to utilize the additive model, we would first look at apartment A, assign a score subjectively to each of these attributes, and then add them all up. And we got +4 once we've done that. We would do the same thing for apartment B, add all these up, and we get a +6. So at this point in time, +6 is higher than +4, which suggests that we would pick apartment B. Now, to illustrate the additive difference, we can assign an attribute for each attribute a specific score. Apartment A, +1 for rent. Apartment B is +2. And we take the difference between these and write it over here in this column. So there's a -1. We then take the difference between noise levels, -5. -2 minus 3 is -5. 3 minus a -1, gotta think back to your elementary days, becomes a +4. 2 minus 2 is 0. And then we add up the difference scores, and we get a -2. In this case, a negative number indicates that there are more positives associated with apartment B compared to apartment A. Even when we do something like this, and we assign these attributes subjective values, and we see that apartment B seems like, by all accounts, to be the better choice between these two alternatives. The question is, what decision do we actually make? If the most important criteria you consider is rent, by all means, apartment B would be the better choice because it apparently has a lower rent per month compared to apartment A, which means you'd have more money in your pocket at the end of the month. However, if the most important criteria for you, if the rent's very similar, is distance to campus, apartment A would be the better choice, despite the fact that, yes, the noise level may not be great. Now, in the real world, Sometimes it's hard to make decisions when we focus only on their positive attributes, because the positive attributes could be very similar. So to eliminate alternatives, sometimes we have to focus on the negative attributes. And that's what non-compensatory models propose. Now, one example, elimination by aspects, proposes that we will look at one attribute at a time and will reject any alternatives that do not meet the minimum criteria for that attribute. And once we've done that, if there are alternatives remaining, we'll go to the second attribute, and then the third, and so on and so forth. The conjunctive model proposes that we will evaluate one alternative at a time, and if there are any attributes in that alternative that fail to meet our minimum criteria, we automatically eliminate that alternative. And lastly, the satisficing search says that rather than compare every single alternative for every single attribute, we will choose among the first alternative that satisfies the minimum criteria for each attribute. Now, this is different than if we're concerned with maximizing our decision-making process, as you'll see in just a few minutes. So, going back to the rent example, I have transformed those subjective values into more diagnostic criteria. So for example, the rent for apartment A is $1,000 and we say the rent for apartment B is $850, $150. The noise level, remember we said it's really loud here for apartment A, so it's turned down for what? Apartment B is nice and quiet, it's very peaceful. Distance to campus, remember that was a positive for apartment A. It's less than 2 miles away. You can walk that. May not want to when it's hot outside, but you could walk it. Apartment B, it's 10 miles away, which means there's a good chance you're going to either have to ride the bus for a while or maybe get stuck fighting through traffic. Let's pretend we only have $900 for rent. According to elimination by aspects, we would eliminate apartment A and choose apartment B. Why? Well, rent is the first attribute we're considering, and apartment A doesn't meet that criteria. So now, the only thing that's left that meets that criteria is apartment B. And so we pick apartment B by default. Let's assume now that we have $1,000 for rent. Both apartments meet this criteria for that attribute. Yes, apartment A is more expensive, but we can afford it. So according to elimination by aspects, we would have to go to the next attribute, which is noise level, and choose between whatever minimum criteria we have there. So if you need quiet, elimination by aspects would result in choosing apartment B. We can afford it, and it's quiet. But if you don't mind noisy, or you prefer noisy, we'd pick apartment A because we can afford it, because we have $1,000 for rent, and there's always a party happening here. Let's pretend you want to use a conjunctive search. So to do this, you would look at all attributes for one alternative before you consider all the attributes for the other alternative. So apartment A, we would work our way down the list of attributes and check off if they meet our criteria. $1,000, well, we got $1,000 for rent, that's a check. Turned down for what? Maybe we like the noise. That's a check. Or we can live with it. Distance to campus, less than 2 miles, that could be a big check for some people. Cleanliness, not too bad. That's a check. We would then go through the list of attributes for apartment B, and you'll notice there's a big X next to about 10 miles away from campus. Maybe we don't mind living 2 miles away from campus, but our minimum criteria is within 5 miles. Because at 10 miles away, there's a good chance that when we try to drive to campus, we could get stuck in traffic. And that is not fun for anyone involved. Therefore, because apartment B does not have a check for all attributes, we eliminate it and we go with apartment A. At this point in time, you may be wondering about the last non-compensatory model of decision making called satisficing. So what is satisficing? Down below here, I have an image of Mark Schullerth. He's a former NFL player and a current analyst for ESPN. And he oftentimes uses a phrase that I really like, paralysis by analysis. What he's referring to in the sports world is the fact that you could consider all the pros and cons about picking up a player or signing a player. And you could analyze every single detail, every single play, and reach a point where you still cannot make a decision. Now, if we extrapolate that kind of logic to picking an apartment, we can make an exhaustive list of every single thing we could possibly consider that's important when picking an apartment. And we could compare each apartment across every single attribute we have. And even after we do that, we may still be stuck at a position where they're so similar that there's no clear choice to be made. So, satisficing, oftentimes we categorize people as being either maximizers or satisficers. Now, sometimes we could be either or depending on the context, but in general, maximizers are going to be people who, when they are faced with making a choice, they don't make just any choice. They have to pick the best choice. Meaning, if we're looking at apartments in here in San Antonio, they're going to compare almost every single apartment. And they're going to see which one's going to give them the best combination of the lowest rent, the closest distance to campus, the best noise level that they're looking for. Could be loud, could be quiet, depending on their preference. And it has to be super clean. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, what are the odds of that? We don't know. There's no guarantee that they won't find this perfect combination of these 4 attributes. But there's also no guarantee they will find this. It's uncertain. And they may spend a lot of time and energy comparing all these different alternatives. And who's to say they don't reach a point where they're paralyzed because of their analysis? They've overanalyzed everything and they still can't make a choice. Well, satisficers are the type of people that say, look, ain't nobody got time for that. I don't have time to look at every single alternative. And I don't need to worry about getting the perfect apartment for all these attributes. What I need is an apartment that I can afford, that isn't too noisy or too quiet, maybe, that is relatively close to campus, and is fairly clean. I find that combination of things, I'm good to go. I don't need to expend a lot of time and energy looking and comparing all these different alternatives. And ultimately, satisficers are the type of people who don't worry about whether or not the grass is always greener on the other side. Whereas a maximizer, even if they make what they think is the best choice, there could always be that doubt. Did I truly make the best choice? I'm going to go buy this car. Everything tells me that this is the best car to buy. And I buy that car. Who's to say it ends up not being a piece of crap? All the research you did told you it is what you want. This is what you want. This is the vehicle. You're going to be in love with this car. You're Eleanor. And you get it, and it ends up letting you down. And you say, well, that's probably not going to happen if you do your research. We don't know that for certain because decisions are made in the face of uncertainty. Even when we assign subjective probabilities to specific outcomes, there are no guarantees. So, just a couple closing remarks to summarize what we have discussed in this initial segment on decision making. All decisions occur during uncertainty. Even when we know the probabilities, there's always uncertainty involved because there's no guarantee that things are going to work out exactly how we plan. Even in the Monty Hall problem, just because you switch does not mean you're guaranteed to win because you could switch from the car to a goat. Now, given that all the decisions occurred during uncertainty, ABCs are always present. There are always different alternatives we can choose. And we may have beliefs about these alternatives. One alternative may make us more happy than the other. We believe that alternative will make us happier than the other. Now, once we choose a specific alternative based on our beliefs, there may be consequences, or there will be consequences. Now, whether those consequences are good or bad or a combination of both, sometimes that in itself is uncertainty. Now, based on this, there are different theories that have been proposed to explain how people make decisions. So, compensatory models suggest that we focus on positive attributes and we allow those to outweigh the negative. So, focus on the good things and allow those to overshadow the negatives. So options that have more positives are going to be the options we pursue. Other times, we may have to eliminate alternatives based on the negatives first. So, like the apartment example, if we have a budget of $500 a month, we can't afford to rent an apartment that's $1,000 a month. Therefore, we have to eliminate that option. Even though it is technically an option, it's not an option that we can truly pursue. And lastly, way we sometimes classify people's decision making is in terms of these generic labels satisficing versus maximizing. Satisficing occurs when we choose options based on if they're good enough, if they meet just the minimum criteria that we need them to meet. Look, I don't want to spend all day figuring out what is the best movie to go see. I'm just going to pick the first or second comedy I come across. And if it has this particular actor, they're pretty funny, I'll go watch it. Maximizers will say, you know what, oh, no, I'm not dropping $10 on a movie ticket for just to go see something that isn't good. I'm going to do some research. I'm going to read the reviews. I'm going to look to see who's in the movie, whether or not the movie's won awards, and spend so on and so on and so on until they figure out the perfect movie to go see. Now, if this took place in real life, maybe you're the type of person to do this. One of the questions that I would ask you to ask yourself, how many times have you tried to maximize and it led to an undesirable outcome? You did all your research, you thought you made the right choice, and you come to find out it didn't live up to your expectations. Sometimes this happens in real life. So maximizing would be a form of a normative theory, how we should make a decision. Satisficing, that may be more of a descriptive theory, how we actually decide.